Sorry, gotta show my true colors there. All right. So, whether you're someone who likes coffee or tea or you can't stand them, I think we all can acknowledge the importance of goods like coffee or tea within the modern world. Right? It's one of the most traded commodities, imported commodities into the United States, and again all over the world. The topic of this mini lecture is 18th century Europe. And we're going to talk about 5 things that you need to know in order to get into your reading and research about life at this time. One of the things, and so we'll start off with this, is coffee houses. European life in the 18th century is transforming from a lot of ways, right? So different kingdoms transform in different ways, right? There's differences in England versus France versus what will become Germany versus what will be, Poland, etc. Well, particularly within England and in parts of France, coffee houses are the thing, right? So we're not talking drive-through Starbucks, that kind of deal, but we are talking a place where folks who have now reached a level of class standing where they can go and sit at a coffee house and talk about the politics of the day, the news of the day, they can do that. And this is a space and a place for them to do that as opposed to the taverns of yesteryear, right? Taverns, played a big role in a large part of English society and in some of these other communities too. So coffee houses are a big place for what we would call the bourgeoisie or the petit bourgeois to engage in sort of political debate and to read the many newspapers that these urban areas were seeing published at the time. All right, secondly, consumer culture. So today, of course, we have instant delivery of all kinds of things. In the 20th century, you had major stores that could ship things after you order it from a catalog, right? That kind of thing. In the 18th century, you have the beginnings of industrialization in kingdoms like England, and you're going to have a rising consumer culture that far more individuals are going to have access to than we usually tend to acknowledge. I know for me, when I first learned about life in the 1700s, I kind of thought, both in the colonies and in Europe, that basically everybody had to make everything, that you couldn't necessarily go to a store and find stuff, that none of that would have happened. That's not true. So as the years go, there is an increasing access to a consumer culture which will provide more and more goods and material goods for people. Now, some of these goods are made in England and then shipped all over. Some of these are made in China and imported. Goods made in China, particularly, were considered highly valued at that point. The manner in which they understood where goods came from, we tend to reverse some of that today. Third, bourgeoisie or middle class. So, with rising industrialization, rising mercantilism, rising trade, colonialism, all these different factors, particularly within England, you're going to see the rise of a robust middle and upper middle class. These folks aren't nobles, but they've got some wealth, and they can use this to create a new kind of class identity, and they're going to do that. Now, this kind of thing happens throughout time, right? So in America in the 50s, right, the rising middle class, right, the keeping up with the Joneses, all of that. But in the 18th century in England, and in even parts of Ireland as well, you're going to see this. You're going to see some of it in France and some of it in Germany, Berlin. You'll see some of this. But again, England is kind of a good example. So again, the two phrases for this are either middle class or bourgeoisie. You'll see in some books a phrase called petit bourgeois, which kind of is like on the margins of the class, middle class. All right. Fourthly, enlightened absolutism. So the Enlightenment's going to be a big part of the 18th century. We're going to talk about it in a second. But one of the aspects of it was some absolutist leaders felt that they could kind of take from the Enlightenment movement and kind of apply it to their version of centralization, right? Centralized states. They could kind of reform and govern better. Now, usually what this did was they wanted to make themselves more efficient, absolute monarchs. So it isn't necessarily better leadership, it's just more efficient leadership. It doesn't necessarily mean inclusion for people, but enlightened absolutism would be, part of the process of the 18th century. All right, and the Enlightenment would be the last thing. So the Enlightenment is the one that most folks hear about, even when they're younger, and it's a broad-based movement from the early 1700s up until about 1799. It's got three phases, and generally, from a political standpoint, there was a belief that with reason, society can progress, and what you end up seeing is support for versions of democratic governance or leadership. The idea that within certain communities there should be some form of voting, there should be greater access or inclusivity. Now, again, this is 18th century versions of inclusivity. This is not, equity or inclusion as we might define it in the 21st century. Their definition of this might be all white men of property can vote. That's it, right? That their version of enlightenment is very different than our version of enlightenment. But again, of course, there are political implications for the revolutions of the end of the 18th century. And again, there's a lot of different ways to approach enlightenment. But again, it de-emphasizes the role of institutions, particularly the role of the church, and places this emphasis on reason and progress and new kinds of professional science. Thank you so much.